The dusty floorboards of Macready's saloon had seen plenty of drama in their time, but nothing quite like what happened on that sweltering August afternoon in 1952, when the doors swung open and revealed a young woman in a wedding dress. Struggling with each step she took, the laughter that erupted from the crowd would soon turn to stunned silence. What followed was a moment that would change not just one life, but the entire soul of a small Texas town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun beat down mercilessly on the main street of Millbrook, Texas, casting long shadows from the wooden storefronts that lined the dusty thoroughfare. It was the kind of heat that made even the lizards seek shade, and most sensible folks had retreated indoors to wait out the worst of it. But inside Macready's saloon, the afternoon crowd was just getting started, their voices growing louder with each round of drinks. Margaret Thornfield stood at the corner of Main and Cedar, her white wedding dress already wilted from the oppressive heat. The satin fabric clung uncomfortably to her skin, and beads of perspiration dotted her forehead beneath the delicate lace veil that had belonged to her grandmother. But it wasn't the weather that made her hands shake as she gripped the carved wooden cane that had become her constant companion since the accident 6 months ago. The dress had been altered hastily just 3 days before, when Dr. Patterson had finally given her permission to walk without the heavy leg brace she'd worn since February. The seamstress, Mrs. Holloway, had worked through the night to adjust the hemline and take in the waist, which had grown smaller during the long months of recovery. The result was beautiful, even if Margaret couldn't see it that way. All she could focus on was the pronounced limp that made her right leg drag slightly with each step, a permanent reminder of the icy morning when her horse had spooked and thrown her against the rocky outcropping near Willow Creek. From where she stood, Margaret could hear the raucous laughter spilling out of Macready's saloon. The establishment had a reputation as the rowdiest watering hole in 3 counties, attracting cowboys, drifters, and local troublemakers who came for the cheap whiskey and cheaper entertainment. It wasn't the kind of place a respectable young woman would normally be caught dead in, let alone on her wedding day, but respectability had become a luxury Margaret could no longer afford. Her intended groom, Charles Whitmore, came from one of the wealthiest families in the county. The Whitmores owned the largest cattle ranch for miles around, and Charles had been groomed since childhood to eventually take over the operation. When he'd proposed to Margaret the previous autumn, it had seemed like a fairy tale come true. She was the daughter of the town's modest general store owner, and while the Thornfields were well respected, they certainly weren't wealthy. The engagement had raised eyebrows among the social elite, but Charles had been adamant that love conquered all obstacles. That was before the accident changed everything. The injury itself was devastating enough, a compound fracture that had required 2 surgeries and left her with a permanent limp. But the real blow came 3 weeks later when Dr. Patterson delivered the news that Margaret's pelvis had also been damaged. The likelihood of her ever bearing children, he explained gently, was extremely slim. In a time and place where a woman's primary value was often measured by her ability to produce heirs, this revelation was nothing short of catastrophic. Charles had maintained his commitment publicly, even as his mother, Victoria Whitmore, launched an increasingly aggressive campaign to end the engagement. The woman made no secret of her belief that her son deserved better than a damaged bride who couldn't give him the children he needed to carry on the family name. She'd enlisted the help of other prominent families in town, and soon Margaret found herself facing a wall of social pressure that felt impossible to breach. The breaking point had come just that morning, as Margaret was making her final preparations for the wedding ceremony. Charles had arrived at the Thornfield home an hour before they were supposed to leave for the church, his face pale and his hands trembling as he sat across from her in the small parlor. "I can't do this, Margaret," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mother says if I go through with the wedding, she'll disinherit me completely. The ranch, everything. It'll all go to my cousin Robert instead." Margaret had stared at him in stunned silence, her wedding bouquet of wildflowers wilting in her lap. She'd known this moment was coming, had seen it building in the way Charles avoided her eyes during their recent conversations, in the way he'd grown increasingly distant as the wedding day approached, but knowing something and experiencing it were entirely different things. "So you're choosing the ranch over me," she'd said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "It's not that simple," Charles had protested. "Without the inheritance, what kind of life could I offer you? We'd have nothing, Margaret, nothing at all." "We'd have each other," she'd replied. But even as the words left her mouth, she could see they held no weight with him. The conversation that followed was brief and brutal. Charles made it clear that while he still cared for her, he wasn't willing to sacrifice his entire future for their relationship. He offered to help her save face by claiming the decision was mutual, but Margaret had refused. If he was going to abandon her, she wasn't going to help him look noble while doing it. After he left, Margaret had sat alone in her wedding dress for nearly an hour, staring at her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, and marked by a pain that went far deeper than her physical injuries. It was then that she'd made a decision that shocked even herself. If Charles Whitmore thought he could humiliate her by leaving her at the altar, then she was going to show him and everyone else in Millbrook exactly what she thought of their judgment. Margaret had heard the stories about Macready's Saloon, about the weekly poker games that drew men from all over the county, about the dancing girls who performed on Saturday nights, and about the fights that regularly spilled out onto the street. She'd also heard about the Vietnam War veterans who'd started gathering there in recent months, men who'd returned home to find themselves unwelcome in more respectable establishments. The townspeople whispered about their drinking, their unpredictable moods, and their inability to readjust to civilian life. But Margaret had also heard something else about these men, that they understood what it meant to be broken, to be judged for circumstances beyond their control, to be dismissed by a society that had once claimed to value them. Now, as she stood at the corner watching the saloon's batwing doors swing back and forth in the hot breeze, Margaret felt a strange sense of kinship with those outcasts. She'd spent months trying to prove she was still worthy of respect, still deserving of love despite her injuries. She'd endured countless pitying looks, well-meaning but painful advice, and increasingly obvious attempts by former friends to distance themselves from her misfortune. The final straw had been Mrs. Whitmore's visit the previous week. The older woman had arrived at the general store during the afternoon rush, making sure her words would be overheard by as many people as possible. "It's really for the best, dear," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "A woman in your condition would only hold Charles back. He needs a wife who can give him strong, healthy children, not someone who'll be a burden for the rest of his life." The words had cut deeper than any physical wound Margaret had endured. But what hurt even more was the silence that followed, the way the other customers had suddenly found their shopping lists fascinating, the way no one had spoken up in her defense. Even her own father had simply continued restocking shelves, his shoulders tense with embarrassment. That night, Margaret had made her decision. If the respectable people of Millbrook considered her damaged goods, then perhaps it was time to seek out the company of others who understood what it meant to be cast aside. She adjusted her grip on the cane and took a deep breath, tasting dust and the distant smell of cattle on the wind. The wedding dress felt heavier with each step, but she forced herself to move forward. Behind her, she could hear the church bells beginning to toll, a reminder that, at this very moment, wedding. Guests were probably filing into pews, expecting to witness a ceremony that would never happen. Let them wait, Margaret thought grimly. Let them all wait and wonder and whisper among themselves about the bride who never showed up. As she approached Macready's saloon, the sounds from inside grew louder. Someone was playing a harmonica badly, accompanied by off-key singing and the rhythmic thump of boots on wooden floors. The smell of tobacco and whiskey drifted out through the doors, mixing with the ever-present scent of dust and horse manure that permeated every corner of Millbrook. Margaret paused at the entrance, her hand hovering over the brass handle of the batwing door. Through the gap between the doors, she could see the shadowy interior of the saloon, rough wooden tables scattered across a sawdust-covered floor, a long bar dominated by bottles of various shapes and sizes, and perhaps 24 men in various states of inebriation. Some wore the faded work clothes of ranch hands, others the dusty attire of traveling salesmen or drifters. But in the far corner, she could make out a small group that looked different from the rest. These men sat straighter despite their obvious intoxication, their hair cut shorter than the fashion dictated, their clothes cleaner and better maintained than those of the other patrons. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the telltale signs that marked them as military veterans. The way they positioned themselves with their backs to the wall, the quick, alert glances they cast toward the entrance whenever the doors moved, the careful spacing between their chairs that suggested men accustomed to quick movement and potential danger. One of them, a tall man with prematurely grey hair and a face that looked older than his years, was wearing what appeared to be a military dress uniform jacket over regular civilian pants. Even in the dim light of the saloon, Margaret could see the glint of medals pinned to his chest, small rectangles of coloured ribbon and metal that told stories she could only imagine. For a moment, Margaret's resolve wavered. What was she really hoping to accomplish here? What kind of statement was she trying to make by walking into the roughest establishment in town, wearing a wedding dress and carrying a cane? The rational part of her mind screamed that this was madness, that she should turn around and go home, face the embarrassment and gossip like a proper lady. But the rational part of her mind was no longer in control. Margaret pushed through the batwing doors and stepped into Macready's saloon. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The harmonica player hit a particularly sour note and fell silent, and even the bartender paused in the middle of wiping down a glass to stare at the unexpected visitor. For a moment, that felt like an eternity. The only sound in the room was the tick of the large clock hanging behind the bar and the soft whisper of Margaret's dress against the sawdust-covered floor. Then someone snickered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly the entire saloon erupted in laughter. Men doubled over their drinks, slapping tables and pointing at Margaret as if she were the finest entertainment they'd seen in months. The laughter had a cruel edge to it, fed by whiskey and the mob mentality that often took hold in places like this. "Well, I'll be damned," called out a voice from somewhere in the crowd. "Looks like somebody's bride got herself lost. Maybe she's looking for her groom," another voice suggested, sparking fresh peals of laughter. "You boys seen any fella desperate enough to marry a cripple?" The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but she forced herself to keep walking deeper into the saloon. Her cane tapped against the floor with each step, the sound somehow audible despite the continuing laughter and crude comments from the crowd. She could feel dozens of eyes following her progress, could hear the whispered speculation about what had brought her here and what kind of spectacle she was planning to make of herself. "Poor thing probably got stood up at the altar," someone else observed with mock sympathy. "Can't say I blame the fella who wants to be tied down to damaged goods," Margaret's face burned with humiliation, but she kept moving toward the bar. She had no clear plan beyond proving to herself and everyone else that she wouldn't be broken by their judgment. If they wanted to see her as a figure of ridicule, then so be it. She'd survived worse than their laughter. The bartender, a heavy-set man with graying whiskers and suspicious eyes, watched her approach with obvious discomfort. Macready's saloon might not have the highest standards, but even they rarely served unaccompanied women, especially ones dressed for their wedding day. "Miss," he said carefully, "I think maybe you're in the wrong place." "I don't think I am," Margaret replied, her voice carrying farther than she'd intended in the suddenly quieter room. "I'd like a whiskey, please." This request sparked another wave of laughter, even louder than before. The idea of a properly dressed lady, even a damaged one, ordering hard liquor in a place like Macready's struck the patrons as hilariously inappropriate. "You heard the lady, Jake," called out one of the cowboys near the back. "Give the bride a drink. Maybe it'll help her forget about whoever was smart enough to run." The bartender looked uncertain, glancing between Margaret and his other customers, as if trying to decide whether serving her would cause more trouble than refusing. Meanwhile, the comments from the crowd grew increasingly crude and personal, focusing on Margaret's limp, her abandoned status, and creative speculation about why her groom had failed to appear. Through it all, Margaret noticed that one table remained conspicuously quiet. The group of veterans in the corner hadn't joined in the laughter or the cruel commentary. Instead, they watched the proceedings with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to openly disapproving. The man in the military jacket had set down his drink entirely and was studying Margaret with an intensity that made her both nervous and oddly hopeful. "Look at her trying to act all dignified," someone near the front was saying. "Honey, nobody's fooled by the fancy dress. We all know what you really are, a reject that nobody wanted." The words were designed to hurt, and they succeeded. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she was determined not to let them fall. She'd come here to make a point about her own worth, but instead she was simply providing entertainment for people who saw her pain as amusing. It was then that she heard the scrape of a chair being pushed back from the table in the corner. The tall veteran with the grey hair stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. The medals on his chest caught the light from the oil lamps as he walked across the room, his boots clicking against the wooden floor with military precision. The laughter began to fade as other patrons noticed his approach, uncertainty replacing amusement as they took in his size and bearing. Margaret watched him come closer, wondering if he was simply another person preparing to add his voice to the chorus of mockery. But something in his expression suggested otherwise. His eyes, she noticed, held the same kind of pain she'd seen in her own reflection, the look of someone who'd been broken and rebuilt, who understood what it meant to be judged for things beyond their control. When he reached her position at the bar, he stopped and looked directly at her for the first time. Up close, Margaret could see that he was younger than his grey hair suggested, probably not much older than her own 24 years. The lines around his eyes spoke of experiences that had aged him prematurely, and there was a slight tremor in his left hand that he tried to conceal by keeping it pressed against his leg. Without saying a word, he began to unpin the medals from his jacket. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in Macready's saloon fixed on the veteran as he carefully removed the first medal from his jacket, a bronze star that gleamed dully in the lamplight. His fingers worked with practiced precision, though Margaret could see the slight tremor that betrayed his calm exterior. "What the hell you doing, soldier boy?" demanded Buck Morrison, a local ranch foreman known for his quick temper and quicker fists. "Nobody asked you to get involved in this little show." The veteran didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed the bronze star gently on the bar next to Margaret's gloved hand, the metal making a soft chiming sound against the worn wood. The Purple Heart came next, followed by a silver star that caught the light like a fragment of captured. "Sunlight. Name's Thomas Hartwell," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl that spoke of origins far from Texas. "Sergeant, 1st Infantry Division, 3 tours in Korea, 2 in Vietnam." He removed another medal, this one Margaret didn't recognize. "And I'm thinking this lady deserves a hell of a lot more respect than what she's getting." Buck Morrison laughed, but it sounded forced now, lacking the cruel confidence from moments before. "That's real touching, Tom, but the crippled bride ain't your concern. Why don't you sit back down and mind your own business?" Thomas finished, removing the last medal and set it beside the others. Without his decorations, the military jacket looked strangely empty, like a shell that had lost its meaning. He turned to face the crowd fully, and Margaret noticed how his stance shifted. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced, hands loose at his sides. It was the posture of a man who'd learned to fight for his life and hadn't forgotten the lessons. "See, that's where you're wrong, Buck," Thomas said, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge that made several men shift uncomfortably in their seats. "A man's got a duty to stand up when he sees something wrong happening. And what I'm seeing? Here is a bunch of cowards picking on a woman who's got more courage in her little finger than the lot of you combined." The accusation of cowardice hit the room like a slap. These were men who prided themselves on their toughness, their ability to handle whatever life threw at them. Being called cowards by a veteran, especially one with Thomas's obvious combat experience, was an insult that couldn't be ignored. "Courage?" Buck stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What's courageous about a woman who can't even walk right showing up here in a wedding dress like some kind of freak show?" "The courage," Thomas replied, "is in knowing that everyone in this room is going to judge her, mock her, try to break her spirit, and doing it anyway. That's more guts than most soldiers I've served with ever showed." Margaret felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. In 6 months of pity and whispered conversations, no one had suggested that her struggles required any kind of bravery. Most people seemed to think she should simply accept her diminished circumstances gracefully and fade into the background of their lives. "You don't know what you're talking about," snarled Pete Connolly, another ranch hand with a reputation for meanness. "That girl's here because she's desperate for attention. Her fancy boy dumped her this morning, and now she's making a spectacle of herself. Is that right?" Thomas looked at Margaret for the first time since he'd started speaking. His eyes were a startling shade of green, she noticed, and they held a question that seemed to ask whether she wanted him to continue fighting this battle for her. Margaret straightened her shoulders as much as her injury would allow. "Charles Whitmore decided he couldn't marry me because his mother threatened to disinherit him if he went through with the wedding. Apparently, having a wife who limps is too high a price to pay for love." The admission sent a ripple of conversation through the crowd. Most of them knew Charles and his family, knew the kind of pressure Victoria Whitmore could bring to bear when she wanted something. But admitting the truth out loud, especially in front of this audience, was either very brave or very foolish. "So you came here to what, exactly?" Buck demanded. "Drink yourself into a stupor? Show everyone how far you've fallen?" "I came here," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "because I wanted to be around people who understand what it's like to be judged for things beyond their control. People who've been written off by polite society." Thomas smiled at that, not the mocking grin that had been dominating the room, but something warmer and more genuine. "Well, you've certainly come to the right place for that. This is ridiculous," Buck said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier venom. "You're both crazy if we think about what?" Thomas interrupted. "If we think that a person's worth isn't determined by whether they can walk without a limp. If we think that a woman who's been abandoned by her fiancé still deserves basic human decency." The questions hung in the air like a challenge. Several men in the crowd looked uncomfortable now, perhaps realizing that their entertainment had taken a darker turn than they'd intended. Jake, the bartender, cleared his throat nervously. "Look, I don't want any trouble in here. Maybe we should all just—" "There won't be any trouble," Thomas said firmly. "I'm just going to buy this lady a drink, and we're going to sit down and have a civilized conversation. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to discuss it with me outside." The offer was made politely, but there was steel underneath the courtesy. Thomas might have been outnumbered, but he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd faced worse odds and survived. Buck Morrison looked around the room, clearly hoping for support from his friends. But the other men seemed reluctant to escalate the situation further. Picking on a woman with a limp was one thing. Going up against a decorated combat veteran was something else entirely. "Fine," Buck muttered, settling back into his chair, "but don't expect us to pretend this is normal." "I don't expect anything from you," Thomas replied. He turned to Jake. "2 whiskeys, if you please, and make them the good stuff, not the rot gut. You usually serve." The bartender hesitated for a moment, then reached for a bottle from the top shelf. As he poured the drinks, Thomas gathered up his medals from the bar and dropped them into his jacket pocket without ceremony. "Why did you do that?" Margaret asked quietly. "Take off your medals, I mean." Thomas considered the question as he picked up his glass, because sometimes the things we're most proud of can become barriers between us and other people. "Those medals tell a story about who I was in the war, but they don't say anything about who I am right now. And right now, I'm just a man talking to a woman who's had a hard day." Margaret felt something inside her chest loosen, a knot of tension she hadn't even realized was there. When was the last time someone had talked to her like she was just a person, not a victim or an object of pity? "Besides," Thomas continued, taking a sip of his whiskey, "I figured if you were brave enough to walk in here wearing that dress, knowing what kind of reception you'd get, then I could be brave enough to put aside the things that make me feel safe." They moved to a small table near the window, away from the main crowd, but still clearly visible to everyone in the room. The conversations gradually resumed around them, though Margaret could feel curious glances being cast in their direction. "So," Thomas said, settling into his chair with visible effort. Margaret noticed he favored his right leg, suggesting his own struggles with injury. "Tell me about Charles Whitmore." "What's to tell?" Margaret replied bitterly. "He's weak. I thought I loved him, but it turns out I was in love with the idea of him. The man I thought he could be, not the man he actually is." "That's a hard lesson to learn," Thomas said. "I've been there myself in different circumstances." "You were engaged?" "Married, actually. Her name was Susan." Thomas's expression grew distant. "Met her just before I shipped out to Korea the first time. We had a whirlwind romance, got married 3 days before I left. She promised to wait for me, write letters, keep the home fires burning." "What happened?" "I came back different than when I left. War changes a man, and not always in ways that are easy to live with." Susan tried to understand, but she'd built up this image in her mind of the hero who was going to come home and sweep her off her feet. Instead, she got a man who woke up screaming from nightmares, who couldn't handle crowds or loud noises, who drank too much, trying to forget things that couldn't be forgotten. Margaret studied his face, seeing the pain that lingered there despite the passage of time. "She left you. She tried to stick it out for about 6 months, but in the end she said she'd married a soldier, not a broken man. Took half of what little we had, and moved back to her mother's place in California. Haven't seen her since." The parallel between their situations wasn't lost on either of them. Both had been abandoned by people who claimed to love them when they became inconvenient or difficult to handle. "Do you hate her?" Margaret asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass slowly between his hands. "I used to. Spent a lot of nights drinking and feeling sorry for myself, cursing her name and anyone who'd listen. But after a while, I realized that hate was just another kind of prison. She made her choice based on what she could handle, just like Charles did. Can't say I respect it, but I understand it. I don't think I'm ready to be that forgiving yet, Margaret admitted. That's fair. The wound's still fresh for you. Give it time. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the grimy window. Outside, Margaret could see people walking along Main Street, going about their normal business while her own life lay in ruins just a few blocks away. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said, eventually. "Of course. What did you really come here hoping to find?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She'd been so focused on the dramatic gesture of walking into the saloon that she hadn't really considered what she wanted to happen next. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think I wanted to prove something to myself, to Charles, to everyone who thinks I'm just damaged goods now, but I'm not sure what I was trying to prove." "Maybe," Thomas suggested, "you were trying to prove that you're still the same person you always were, just with a different way of walking." "But I'm not the same person," Margaret protested. "The accident changed everything, not just physically, but everything. The way people look at me, the way they talk to me, the opportunities that are available to me. Charles was right about one thing: I can't give him the children he wants, the family he deserves." "Who says what he deserves?" Thomas asked sharply. "And who decided that a woman's only value is in bearing children?" The question was radical enough to make Margaret uncomfortable. In 1952, the idea that a woman might have worth beyond her domestic capabilities was not widely accepted, especially in a conservative place like Millbrook. "It's just the way things are," she said weakly. "Things are the way they are because people accept them without question," Thomas replied. "But that doesn't make them right. I've seen women in field hospitals overseas who were saving lives while their husbands sat safe at home. I've known female resistance fighters who showed more courage than any man I ever served with. Value isn't determined by what you can or can't do with your body. It's determined by what you do with your mind and your heart." Margaret felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't born of humiliation or despair. Instead, they came from a place she hadn't accessed in months: hope. "The people in this town," she said carefully, "they're never going to see me that way. To them, I'll always be the crippled girl who got left at the altar." "Then maybe," Thomas said, leaning forward across the small table, "it's time to stop caring what the people in this town think." The suggestion was both terrifying and liberating. Margaret had spent her entire life trying to fit into Millbrook's narrow definition of respectability. The idea of simply abandoning that effort was almost unthinkable. "Easy for you to say," she replied. "You can leave whenever you want. This is my home, my family's here, what's left of our business. I can't just walk away from everything." "Who says you have to walk away from everything? Maybe you just need to walk away from the parts that are holding you back." Before Margaret could respond, the saloon doors swung open again, and this time the newcomer sent a genuine shock through the room. Victoria Whitmore stood in the entrance, her expensive dress and perfectly arranged hair looking absurdly out of place in the rough surroundings. Behind her stood two men Margaret recognized as the Whitmore family's ranch foreman, their expressions suggesting they'd rather be anywhere else. The older woman's eyes swept the room until they found Margaret, and her face twisted with a mixture of disgust and triumph. "Well," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent saloon, "I suppose this confirms everything I told my son about your true character. A decent woman would have handled her disappointment with grace and dignity, not by making a spectacle of herself in a place like this." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with fresh shame, but before she could respond, Thomas stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with deliberate emphasis. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said politely, though his tone held a warning that made the two ranch hands shift nervously behind their employer. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Thomas Hartwell at your service." Victoria's eyes flicked over him, dismissively. taking in the military jacket and civilian pants, the prematurely grey hair, and the controlled way he held himself. "I'm not interested in making your acquaintance, young man. I'm here to collect Miss Thornfield and return her to her family before she can embarrass herself any further." "I don't think Miss Thornfield needs collecting," Thomas replied evenly. "She's a grown woman, capable of making her own decisions about where she wants to be and who she wants to spend her time with." "This is none of your concern," Victoria snapped. "This girl was supposed to marry my son today, and instead she's here drinking with soldiers and degenerates. Her behavior reflects poorly on our entire family." "Your son," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "abandoned this woman at the altar because you threatened to cut off his inheritance. I'd say any reflection on your family's character starts right there." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's face flushed red with anger, but she couldn't deny the truth of it. "Charles made a practical decision," she said defensively. "My marriage is about more than romantic sentiment. It's about building a future, creating a legacy. A woman who can't fulfill her basic obligations as a wife has no business expecting—" "Ma'am," Thomas interrupted, his courtesy becoming more pronounced, and therefore more threatening, "I'm going to stop you right there. Because if you finish that sentence, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside and explain to me why you think it's acceptable to talk about a lady that way." The offer was made with perfect politeness, but everyone in the room understood the implicit threat. Victoria Whitmore might be used to intimidating people with her wealth and social position, but those weapons were useless against a man who'd already lost everything that mattered to him. For the first time since entering the saloon, Victoria looked uncertain. She glanced at her two companions, but they seemed reluctant to get involved in a confrontation with a combat veteran over what amounted to a social dispute. Margaret watched the standoff with a mixture of fascination and terror. No one had ever stood up to Victoria Whitmore on her behalf. Not her father, not Charles, not even her own friends who'd gradually drifted away as her social status declined. "This is absurd," Victoria said finally, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Margaret, gather yourself up and come with me. Your father is worried sick, and there are still guests waiting at the church." "Let them wait," Margaret said, surprised by her own boldness. "Let them wait and wonder and gossip among themselves. I'm exactly where I want to be." The declaration seemed to shock Victoria more than anything Thomas had said. The idea that Margaret might actually choose to remain in a saloon, drinking with veterans and misfits, rather than return to face the social consequences of her abandoned wedding was apparently beyond her comprehension. "You're making a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your life," Victoria warned. "When you sober up and realize what you've done, don't expect my family to show you any mercy." "I wouldn't dream of it," Margaret replied. Victoria Whitmore's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple that suggested she was fighting to maintain what little composure remained. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, while every person in Macready's saloon held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "You insolent little—" Victoria began, then caught herself as Thomas took a step closer to their table. The movement was subtle, but it carried an unmistakable message about what he thought of women who hurled insults at other women in public. "I think," Thomas said with deceptive calm, "that this conversation has run its course. Mrs. Whitmore, you've delivered your message. Miss Thornfield has given you her response. Perhaps it's time for you to return to your other obligations." Victoria's eyes darted around the room, perhaps hoping to find support among the other patrons. But the men who had been laughing at Margaret earlier now seemed uncomfortable with the idea of supporting a wealthy woman's attack on someone who was clearly down on her luck. There was a code among the rough crowd at Macready's. you might. Mock someone who walked into your territory, but you didn't appreciate outsiders coming in to do the same thing. "This isn't over," Victoria said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Margaret, when you come crawling back begging for forgiveness, remember that you chose this humiliation. You chose to throw away every opportunity for a decent life." "Maybe I did," Margaret replied, feeling a strange sense of freedom in the admission, "but at least I'm choosing. For the first time in my life, I'm actually making my own decisions instead of letting other people tell me what's best for me." To start, words seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow. She'd spent years manipulating the social dynamics of Millbrook, ensuring that everyone knew their place and stayed in it. The idea that someone might simply opt out of the system she'd worked so hard to control was apparently incomprehensible to her. Without another word, Victoria turned on her heel and stalked toward the door, her expensive heels clicking angrily against the wooden floor. Her two escorts followed, looking relieved to be escaping what had become an increasingly uncomfortable situation. As the batwing doors swung shut behind them, the saloon gradually came back to life. Conversations resumed, though they were quieter now, and Margaret noticed that the tenor had changed. The cruel laughter and mocking comments had been replaced by something more thoughtful, more respectful. "Well," said Jake the bartender, breaking the tension with forced joviality, "that was better than a traveling show. Drinks are on the house for the next hour." The announcement was met with scattered cheers and a general loosening of the atmosphere. Several men approached the bar for refills, while others settled back into their card games and conversations. But Margaret noticed that Thomas continued to watch the door, his posture alert and ready. "You think she'll be back?" Margaret asked. "Not tonight," Thomas replied, finally relaxing back into his chair. "But this isn't over. Women like Victoria Whitmore don't give up easy when they think someone's challenged their authority." "What can she do to me that hasn't already been done?" Margaret asked with bitter humor. "I've been abandoned at the altar, publicly humiliated, and written off. By half the town, my reputation is already ruined." "Reputation's just what other people think about you," Thomas said. "And other people's opinions change with the wind. What matters is what you think about yourself." Margaret considered this as she sipped her whiskey, feeling the burn as it went down. The alcohol was starting to affect her. She wasn't used to drinking, especially not the potent stuff Jake had served them. But instead of making her feel worse, it seemed to be washing away some of the fear and self-doubt that had plagued her for months. "Can I tell you something?" she said suddenly. "Of course, I haven't felt this alive in months, not since before the accident. I've been so focused on trying to prove that I'm still the same person I was before, still worthy of the life I was supposed to have, that I forgot what it felt like to just be myself." Thomas smiled at that. "There's something to be said for rock bottom. Once you're there, the only direction left is up." "Is that where you are? Rock bottom?" "Was," Thomas corrected. "I spent about 2 years after Susan left trying to drink myself to death. Lost 3 different jobs, got thrown out of more bars than I can count, ended up sleeping in alleys and abandoned buildings. Finally hit a point where I realized I had a choice. I could keep destroying myself, or I could find a way to build something new from what was left." "What made you choose to build?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "Funny thing about reaching the bottom. It strips away all the things you thought mattered and shows you what actually does. I realized that everything I'd been grieving for, my marriage, my old life, the person I used to be, those things were already gone. Had been gone for a long time. I was just too stubborn to admit it." "So what do you do now?" "I work at Henderson's lumberyard during the week, save up enough money to travel on weekends. See parts of the country I never had time for when I was younger. Take odd jobs here and there, meet different kinds of people, learn new things. It's not the life I planned, but it's mine. Margaret tried to imagine a life like that, free from the expectations and judgments of people like Victoria Whitmore, unbound by the narrow definitions of success and respectability that had governed her existence for 24 years. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. I wouldn't even know where to start, she admitted. You already started, Thomas pointed out. You walked through those doors wearing a wedding dress and asked for a whiskey. That took more courage than most people show in a lifetime. Before Margaret could respond, she became aware of movement. At the table where Thomas's fellow veterans had been sitting, the other men were approaching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been respect. "Thomas," said one of them, a stocky man with a pronounced limp and scars visible on his neck above his collar. "Mind if we join?" "You?" Thomas gestured to the empty chairs around their small table. "Margaret, let me introduce you to some friends of mine. This is Danny Rodriguez. Lost his leg to a landmine outside Busan. Next to him is Billy Crawford, who spent 6 months in a North Korean prison camp. And the tall fellow is Jim Morrison, not the singer," he added with a slight smile, "but he did lose most of his hearing to artillery fire in the Central Highlands." The men nodded politely as they settled into chairs, their movements careful and deliberate in the way of people who'd learned to compensate for various injuries and limitations. "We couldn't help overhearing," Danny said. "That woman who was here, she seemed to think you should be ashamed of yourself for being in a place like this." "That's the general consensus in town," Margaret replied. "Respectable women don't frequent saloons, especially not on their wedding day." "Respectability is overrated," Billy said with a harsh laugh. "I was respectable when I enlisted, had a job at the bank, a nice apartment, plans to marry my high school sweetheart. Army thought I was respectable enough to send me halfway around the world to fight in a war most people couldn't find on a map." "What happened when you came back?" Margaret asked. "Found out that respect only lasts as long as you're useful," Billy replied bitterly. "Bank didn't want to hire a man who jumps every time a car backfires. Girlfriend decided she couldn't handle the nightmares and the drinking. Family thought I should just get over it and go back to being the man I was before. So where does that leave you?" "Here," Jim said, his voice slightly too loud in the way of people who can't properly gauge their own volume. "With other people who understand that sometimes you can't go back, can only go forward." Margaret looked around the table at these men who'd been written off by the same society that was now rejecting her. They were damaged in different ways, carried different kinds of scars, but they'd found a way to exist outside the narrow confines of respectability. "The thing is," Danny added, "we've all had to learn that other people's opinions don't actually have any power over you unless you give it to them. That fancy lady who was here, she's only got as much control over your life as you let her." "Have?" "Easy to say," Margaret replied. "Harder to put into practice. She controls a lot of the social and economic power in this town. Grosser, and you might find yourself shut out of employment opportunities, social events, even basic services. Then maybe," Thomas suggested, "it's time to stop depending on those things." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the front door. Charles Whitmore had entered the saloon, looking deeply uncomfortable and slightly ridiculous in his formal wedding attire. His eyes swept the room until they found Margaret, and then he began making his way toward their table with obvious reluctance. "Oh, hell," Margaret muttered under her breath. Thomas followed her gaze and tensed slightly, his hand moving instinctively toward his pocket where he'd stashed his medals. "Friend of yours?" "My former fiancé," Margaret said, "and from the look on his face, he's here to try to save me from myself." Charles reached their table and stood awkwardly at the edge, clearly uncomfortable with the audience of veterans watching. His every move. His wedding suit was still pristine, his hair perfectly styled, but there was something defeated about his posture that suggested the day hadn't gone according to plan. "Margaret," he said softly, "can we talk privately?" Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my friends, Margaret replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Charles glanced nervously at the four men surrounding the table, taking in their military bearing and obvious loyalty to Margaret. This isn't how I wanted things to go today." "How did you want them to go?" Margaret asked. "You made your choice this morning, Charles. What did you think was going to happen?" "I thought you'd understand," Charles said desperately. "I thought you'd see that I was trying to do what was best for both of us. Without the inheritance, what kind of life could I offer you? We'd have nothing, Margaret, nothing at all. We'd have each other," she replied, echoing her words from that morning. "But apparently that wasn't enough." "That's not fair," Charles protested. "You know I care about you. You know this is killing me, but I have responsibilities to my family, to the ranch, to the people who depend on us for employment. I can't just throw all of that away for—" "For what?" Thomas interrupted quietly. "For love, for loyalty, for keeping your word to the woman you asked to marry you?" Charles turned to face him, his expression shifting from desperation to irritation. "This is between Margaret and me. You have no right to interfere." "I have every right to speak up when I see a man trying to justify abandoning someone who trusted him," Thomas replied evenly. "You made a choice, Charles. Own it. Don't come in here trying to make her feel guilty for not making it easier for you." "You don't understand the situation," Charles said, his voice rising slightly. "There are factors here, complications that you couldn't possibly comprehend." "Enlighten me," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair with deceptive casualness. "What complications justify leaving your bride at the altar?" Charles looked around the table again, perhaps hoping to find a more sympathetic audience among the other veterans, but their expressions ranged from neutral to openly hostile, and he seemed to realize that he wasn't going to find support in this particular crowd. "Fine," he said, his tone becoming defensive. "You want the truth? Margaret can't have children. The doctors made that clear after her accident, and I need heirs to carry on the family name, to inherit the ranch. It's not personal, it's practical." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, not because of her condition, but because Charles had announced it so casually, as if it were just another business consideration. "So you're saying," Danny said slowly, "that this woman's only value to you was as a brood mare?" "That's not what Charles began, but Billy cut him off. "That's exactly what you said," Billy replied. "You just told a room full of strangers that you can't marry her because she can't produce children for you, like she's a piece of livestock that didn't pass inspection." "It's more complicated than that," Charles insisted, but his voice lacked conviction now. "No," Thomas said quietly, "it's really not. You had a choice between the woman you claimed to love and your mother's money. You chose the money. Everything else is just you trying to make yourself feel better about it." Charles' face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "Easy for you to judge when you don't have anything to lose. I have a responsibility to preserve what my family built, to think about the future." "What about Margaret's future?" Jim asked, his voice still too loud, but carrying genuine emotion. "What about her responsibility to herself?" "She'll be fine," Charles said dismissively. "Margaret's always been strong. She'll find someone else, someone who doesn't have the same obligations I do." The casual way he dismissed her prospects, as if her broken engagement was just a minor inconvenience that could be easily overcome, finally broke through Margaret's shocked paralysis. "Get out," she said quietly. Charles blinked. Apparently not, having heard her correctly. "What?" "Get out," Margaret repeated, her voice stronger now. "Leave. Go back to your wedding guests. Go back to your mother. Go back to your precious ranch. But get away from me." "Margaret, please." "No," she said, standing up despite the way her leg protested the sudden movement. "No more pleases, no more explanations, No more justifications. You made your choice, Charles. Now I'm making mine. I choose not to waste another second of my life listening to you try to explain why abandoning me was really for my own good. Charles looked genuinely shocked by her vehemence. Perhaps he'd expected her to beg him to reconsider or to gratefully accept whatever scraps of attention he was willing to offer. The idea that she might simply reject him entirely seemed to catch him completely off guard. "You're making a mistake," he said desperately. "These people, this place, it's not you, Margaret. You're better than this." "Maybe I am," Margaret replied, "but apparently you're not." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Charles stood frozen for a moment, perhaps finally understanding that there would be no reconciliation, no graceful way to undo the damage he'd done that morning. Without another word, he turned and walked quickly toward the door, his formal attire looking increasingly ridiculous in the rough surroundings of the saloon. The batwing doors swung shut behind him with a finality that felt like the closing of a chapter. Margaret sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted by the emotional confrontation. But as she looked around the table at the four men who'd supported her without question, who'd stood up to her tormentors and treated her with more respect than her own fiancé had shown, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt like she belonged somewhere. The sun was beginning to set outside. McGreedy's saloon, casting long shadows through the dusty windows and painting the interior in shades of amber and gold. Margaret had lost track of time, somewhere between her second whiskey and the third round of stories from the veterans' table. For the first time in months, she felt genuinely relaxed, her guard down and her mind clear despite the alcohol. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said, her voice slightly hoarse from talking and laughing more than she had in ages. "I spent 6 months trying to convince everyone that the accident didn't change who I was. But sitting here now, I'm starting to think maybe it did change me. And maybe that's not such a terrible thing." Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on the table, studying her face in the lamplight. "How do you figure? The old Margaret would never have walked into a place like this. She would have gone home after Charles left, cried quietly in her room, and spent the next few months trying to figure out how to rebuild her reputation. She would have been ashamed of being abandoned, would have blamed herself for not being good enough to keep him." "And the new Margaret?" Danny asked with genuine curiosity. "The new Margaret thinks Charles Whitmore is a coward who doesn't deserve her tears," she replied with surprising vehemence. "The new Margaret is sitting in a saloon drinking whiskey with 4 men who've shown her more respect in one afternoon than her fiancé did in 6 months of engagement." Billy raised his glass in a mock toast. "To the new Margaret, then. May she be everything the old one was afraid to be." They clinked glasses around the table, the gesture feeling ceremonial somehow, as if they were marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the alcohol. It was the unfamiliar sensation of being truly accepted, flaws and all. "So what happens now?" Jim asked, his voice carrying that slight uncertainty of someone who couldn't quite gauge his own volume. "You can't stay in this saloon forever, much as we'd enjoy the company." It was a practical question that Margaret had been avoiding. The dramatic gesture of walking into McGreedy's had felt necessary, even liberating, but it couldn't last indefinitely. Eventually, she'd have to face the real world again. Her father's worried questions, the town's gossip, the practical matter of what to do with the rest of her life. "I honestly don't know," she admitted. "I've never made plans that didn't involve Charles or what other people expected of me. I'm not even sure what I want, let alone how to go about getting it." "That's the beautiful thing about starting over," Thomas said. "You get to decide who you want to become instead of just accepting who you've always been told you are." Before Margaret could respond, the saloon doors swung open again, and this time the newcomer made everyone at their table tense up simultaneously. Sheriff Robert Hayes entered with the deliberate stride of a man conducting official business, his badge catching the lamplight as he surveyed the room. Hayes was in his 50s, a career lawman who'd managed to maintain order in Millbrook through a combination of fair dealing and selective blindness to minor infractions. He was generally well respected, but Margaret knew that he owed his current position partly to political support from families like the Whitmores. "Evening, folks," Hayes said, his tone professionally neutral as he approached their table. "Miss Thornfield, I've had some concerned citizens asking me to check on your welfare." "My welfare is just fine, Sheriff," Margaret replied, proud that her voice came out steady despite the sudden spike of anxiety in her chest. "I can see that," Hayes said, glancing around the table at her companions, "though I have to say this isn't where most folks would expect to find a young lady on what was supposed to be her wedding day. Most folks don't know what it's like to be abandoned at the altar," Thomas interjected quietly. "Maybe they should worry less about where she chooses to spend her time and more about the man who left her there." Hayes studied Thomas for a moment, taking in the military bearing and the obvious protectiveness in his posture. "You'd be Thomas Hartwell, I'm guessing. Heard you've been working at Henderson's lumber yard." "That's right. Good man, Henderson. Speaks well of you." Hayes pulled an empty chair from a nearby table and sat down without invitation. "Mind if I join you for a minute? This doesn't have to be official business." The gesture was clearly meant to diffuse tension, but Margaret could see the way the veterans around the table remained alert, ready for trouble. These were men who'd learned not to trust authority figures, even seemingly friendly ones. "What can we do for you, Sheriff?" Margaret asked. "Well, to be honest, I've got Victoria Whitmore breathing down my neck about getting you home safely. She seems to think you're in some kind of danger here." Hayes glanced around the saloon, where the other patrons were doing their best to pretend they weren't listening to every word. "Can't say I see much evidence of that. Mrs. Whitmore is upset because I refused to come quietly when she demanded it," Margaret said. "She's used to getting her way, and she doesn't like being told no. She also mentioned something about you being intoxicated and unable to make sound decisions," Hayes continued, "though you seem lucid enough to me." "I've had a couple of drinks," Margaret admitted, "but I knew exactly what I was doing when I walked in here, and I know exactly what I'm doing now." Hayes nodded slowly. "That's what I figured. But I had to come check, you understand. Part of the job." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "There's something else, though. Your father's been asking around town, looking for you. He's worried sick. This hit Margaret harder than Victoria's threats or Charles's pleading. Her father, Frank Thornfield, was a quiet man who'd raised her alone after her mother died when Margaret was 12. He'd never been one for emotional displays, but she knew he loved her deeply, and the thought of him worrying about her safety made her feel genuinely guilty." "Is he angry?" she asked quietly. "More scared than angry, I'd say. He knows something must have happened with the wedding when you didn't show up, but nobody's told him the details. He's been imagining all sorts of terrible scenarios." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility settling back onto her shoulders. In her determination to reject the expectations of people like Victoria Whitmore, she'd forgotten about the one person whose opinion actually mattered to her. "I should go to him," she said, starting to rise from her chair. "Hold on," Thomas said gently, placing a hand on her arm. "You don't have to rush into anything. Take a minute to think about what you want to say, how you want to handle this." "He's right," Hayes agreed. "Your father's not going anywhere, and he'd rather hear from you when you're ready to talk than have you show up feeling pressured or defensive." Margaret settled back into her chair, grateful for the reprieve, but still feeling the pull of obligation. "What exactly did you tell Mrs. Whitmore?" "That I'd check on you and report back," Hayes replied with a slight smile. "Didn't promise to." drag you home against your will or anything like that. Far as I'm concerned, you're an adult who's broken no laws and isn't in any immediate danger. She won't be satisfied with that, Danny observed. Probably not, Hayes agreed. But Victoria Whitmore's satisfaction isn't really my concern. Keeping the peace in this town is. He stood up and pushed the chair back where he'd found it. Miss Thornfield, you take whatever time you need to sort things out. Just remember that good people are worrying about you, and try not to keep them wondering too long. After the sheriff left, the atmosphere at the table grew more subdued. The reminder of the outside world and its complications had punctured some of the bubble of freedom they'd created around their small group. He seems like a decent man, Thomas observed. He is, Margaret agreed, which makes this harder somehow. If he'd come in here throwing his weight around, demanding I come with him, it would have been easy to resist. But he's right about my father. I can't just disappear and let him think something terrible happened to me. So what are you going to do? Billy asked. Margaret stared into her empty glass, watching the last drops of whiskey catch the lamplight. I'm going to go home and face the music. Tell my father what happened. Deal with whatever consequences come from today. But I'm not going to apologize for being here, and I'm not going to pretend I regret any of it. That's a good start, Thomas said. What about after that? After that? Margaret paused, realizing she was about to voice thoughts that had been forming in her mind throughout the afternoon. After that, I think I'm going to stop trying to fit back into the life I had before the accident. It's gone, and pretending. Otherwise is just making me miserable. So what kind of life do you want instead? Jim asked. I don't know yet, Margaret admitted, but I know I want it to be mine, not something designed to please other people or meet their expectations. I want to wake up in the morning and make decisions based on what I think is right, not what's most socially acceptable. The conversation was interrupted by Jake, the bartender, who approached their table with obvious reluctance. Folks, I hate to break up the party, but we're getting close to closing time. And to be honest, I've got a feeling this place is going to see more unwanted visitors tonight if word keeps spreading about what happened here today. Margaret understood the hint. Her presence in the saloon had already caused enough disruption for one day, and staying longer would only create more problems for Jake and his other customers. You're right, she said, reaching for her purse. What do I owe you for the drinks? On the house, Jake replied quickly. Consider it a wedding present. The irony of the comment drew a genuine laugh from Margaret, the first truly happy sound she'd made all day. Thank you, Jake, for everything. As she prepared to leave, Thomas stood up as well. I'll walk you home, if you don't mind the company. You don't have to do that, Margaret protested, though she found the offer comforting. I know I don't have to, Thomas replied. I want to. Besides, it's getting dark, and a gentleman always sees a lady home safely. Danny, Billy, and Jim also rose from their chairs, and Margaret realized they were all planning to escort her. The gesture was both touching and slightly overwhelming. She wasn't used to having anyone look out for her, let alone 4 decorated veterans who barely knew her. This really isn't necessary, she said, but her protest lacked conviction. Maybe not, Billy said with a grin, but it'll give the town something new to talk about. Imagine the stories they'll come up with about the crippled bride and her army of protectors. The description should have stung, but coming from Billy it somehow felt like a badge of honor instead. These men understood what it meant to be defined by their injuries, and they'd found a way to claim those definitions with pride instead of shame. They left McGreedy's saloon together, stepping out into the cool evening air. The sun had disappeared behind the buildings, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Margaret's wedding dress rustled softly as they walked, the white fabric ghostly in the twilight. The streets of Millbrook were quieter now, most families having retreated indoors for dinner and evening routines. But Margaret could see faces in windows as they passed, could feel the weight of curious stares following their unusual procession. By tomorrow morning, everyone in town would know about the bride who'd spent her wedding day drinking in a saloon with a group of veterans. Having second thoughts? Thomas asked quietly, noticing her glancing at the watching windows. No, Margaret said, surprised to discover she meant it. Let them look. Let them talk. I'm tired of living my life trying to avoid giving people something to gossip about. They walked in companionable silence for several blocks, the only sounds, their footsteps on the wooden sidewalks and the distant lowing of cattle from the ranches outside town. Margaret found herself walking straighter than she had in months, her limp less pronounced when she wasn't concentrating on hiding it. As they turned onto Elm Street, where the Thornfield family lived above their general store, Margaret could see warm light spilling from the windows of their apartment. Her father was home, probably pacing the floor and wondering what had become of his daughter. "This is it," she said, stopping in front of the store. The four men formed a loose semicircle around her, their faces serious in the lamplight from the street corner. For a moment, none of them seemed to know what to say. How do you say goodbye to someone who'd become important to you in the space of a few hours? "Margaret," Thomas said finally, "I want you to know that what happened today, meeting you, seeing you stand up for yourself, it meant something to all of us. You showed more courage in one afternoon than most people manage in a lifetime," Danny added. "And if you ever need anything," Billy continued, "anything at all, you know where to find us." "We're not going anywhere," Jim concluded. Margaret felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed earlier. These came from gratitude, from the overwhelming realization that she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a group of people who accepted her exactly as she was. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you. I don't know what would have happened today if you hadn't been there." "You'd have been fine," Thomas said with quiet conviction. "You had that strength in you all along. You just needed to remember how to use it." They said their final goodbyes, and Margaret watched as the four men walked back toward the center of town, their silhouettes growing smaller in the distance. Then she turned to face the door of her family's store, gathering her courage for the conversation that awaited her upstairs. As she climbed the stairs to the apartment above the store, Margaret could hear her father's footsteps pacing back and forth across the kitchen floor. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and took a deep breath. The old Margaret would have slipped in quietly, apologized profusely, and tried to minimize the disruption she'd caused. But the old Margaret was gone, left behind somewhere. In the sawdust of McGreedy's saloon, the new Margaret opened the door and walked in to face whatever came next. Frank Thornfield stopped pacing the moment he heard the door open. Margaret could see him through the doorway to the kitchen, his grey hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his shirt wrinkled from a day of worry. When their eyes met, she saw relief flood his weathered features, followed immediately by a dozen other emotions she couldn't quite identify. "Margaret," he breathed, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. For a moment she thought he might embrace her, but he stopped short, his hands hovering uncertainty at his sides as he took in her appearance, the wedding dress now wrinkled and dusty, the faint smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke that clung to the fabric, the way her eyes held a different kind of light than they had that morning. "Hello, Papa," she said softly, using the childhood name she hadn't called him in years. Frank's eyes searched her face, looking for signs of distress or harm. "Are you hurt? Are you all right? When you didn't show up at the church, and then Charles came by looking for you, Mrs. Whitmore was making all sorts of wild accusations." His voice trailed off as he struggled to find the right words. "I'm not hurt," Margaret assured him, settling carefully into one of the kitchen chairs. "Not physically, anyway. But we need to talk, Papa. There are things you need to know about what happened today." Frank pulled out the chair across from her, his movements careful and deliberate. Margaret could see the questions burning in his eyes, but he waited patiently for her to begin, the way he'd always done when she was a child, working through some problem or disappointment. "Charles didn't marry me," she said, deciding to start with the basic facts. "He came to the house this morning and called off the wedding, said his mother would disinherit him if he went through with it, and he couldn't risk losing the ranch." Frank's face darkened with anger. "That boy promised to marry you, gave his word in front of half the town. A man doesn't break that kind of promise lightly." "Apparently, he does if his inheritance is at stake," Margaret replied with bitter humor. "Victoria made it clear that a wife who can't bear children isn't worth the sacrifice." The admission hung between them in the kitchen's warm lamplight. Frank had known about the doctor's prognosis, of course. He'd been with her through the long months of recovery, had sat in Dr. Patterson's office when they received the devastating news. But they'd never spoken directly about what it might mean for her future, her prospects for marriage and family. "So that's it then," Frank said quietly. "That's why he ran." "That's why he ran," Margaret confirmed. "But Papa, there's more. After he left, I didn't handle it the way I probably should have." She told him about her decision to go to McReady's saloon, about the laughter and cruel comments from the patrons, about Thomas's intervention and the confrontation with Victoria Whitmore. Frank listened without interruption, his expression cycling. Through shock, concern, and something that might have been admiration. "You went to McReady's," he said when she finished, "in your wedding dress." "I did. And you stayed there all afternoon, drinking with soldiers." "Veterans," Margaret corrected. "Good men who understood what it's like to be judged for things beyond their control." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his calloused hands folded on the table between them. Margaret tried to read his expression, but her father had always been skilled at keeping his thoughts to himself when he needed time to process something. "Are you angry?" she asked finally. "Angry." Frank looked up, surprise replacing the contemplative expression. "Margaret, I've been angry since the moment Charles Whitmore walked into our home this morning and broke his promise to you. I've been angry at Victoria Whitmore for the pressure she's put on that family. Angry at this whole damn town for treating you like damaged goods ever since your accident." The vehemence in his voice caught Margaret off guard. She'd never heard her mild-mannered father speak with such heat about anything. "But I'm not angry at you," he continued, his voice gentling. "Worried, yes. Concerned about what this might mean for your reputation and your future, but not angry. If anything, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." "Proud?" Margaret couldn't hide her astonishment. "Papa, I spent my wedding day drinking in a saloon with men I'd never met before. I embarrassed our family, caused a scandal that will be talked about for months." "You survived," Frank said simply. "You were abandoned and humiliated, and instead of hiding away to lick your wounds, you went out and found people who treated you with respect. That takes guts, Margaret. More guts than I've shown in a long time." Before Margaret could ask what he meant by that, Frank stood up and walked to the window overlooking Main Street. In the distance, they could see the lights from McReady's saloon, where her new friends were probably settling in for a long evening of drinking and storytelling. "You know," Frank said, his back still turned to her, "I never told you much about your mother's family." This was unexpected territory. Frank had always been reluctant to talk about Margaret's mother, Sarah, who died of pneumonia when Margaret was 12. She knew her parents had been deeply in love, that her father had never remarried despite numerous opportunities, but the details of her mother's background had always been vague. "Mama's family was different," Margaret said carefully. "You said they didn't approve of the marriage." "That's putting it mildly," Frank replied with a harsh laugh. "Sarah came from money, Margaret, real money. Her father owned 3 banks in Dallas, had interests in cattle ranching and railroad development. When she fell in love with a small-town shopkeeper, they tried everything they could think of to break us up. Margaret stared at her father's back, trying to process this information. Her mother had been wealthy, had given up a life of privilege. To marry her father, they cut her off completely when we married, Frank continued, and told her she was dead to them, that they'd never acknowledge any children we might have. Sarah didn't care. She said she'd rather be poor with someone who loved her than rich with people who only valued her for what she could bring to a marriage. Alliance, the parallels to her own situation were impossible to ignore. What happened to them? Her family? Oh, they're still there in Dallas, far as I know. Still rich, still convinced they were right to disown her. Probably don't even know they have a granddaughter. Frank turned back to face her, and Margaret could see old pain in his eyes. When Sarah died, I thought about writing to them. Thought maybe they'd want to know about you, help provide for your future. But then I remembered how they'd treated the woman I loved, and I decided you were better off without them. Why are you telling me this now? Frank returned to his chair, reaching across the table to take her hands in his. Because I want you to understand that you come from a line of strong women who weren't afraid to choose their own path, even when it meant giving up everything they'd been taught to value. What you did today, walking away from Charles and his family's expectations, that's exactly what your mother would have done. Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes again. But Mama chose love. She chose you. I just chose. I don't even know what I chose. You chose yourself, Frank said firmly. You chose dignity over security, self-respect over social acceptance. That's not a small thing, Margaret. That's everything. They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped across the kitchen table, as Margaret absorbed this new understanding of her heritage. She'd always thought of herself as practical, conventional, someone who colored within the lines. But apparently rebellion ran in her blood. So what happens now? Frank asked eventually. What do you want to do with this new freedom you've claimed? It was the same question the veterans had asked her, and Margaret still didn't have a complete answer, but sitting in her father's kitchen, feeling his support and understanding, some possibilities began to take shape in her mind. I've been thinking, she said slowly, about what I'm good at, what I enjoy doing. Before the engagement, before I started spending all my time planning a wedding and trying to be the perfect future wife, I used to love working in the store. I was good with the customers, good with the books, good at figuring out what people needed even when they couldn't quite express it themselves. Frank nodded encouragingly. You've always had a head for business. Even as a child, you could spot a profitable opportunity faster than most adults. What if... Margaret paused, the idea still forming. What if we expanded the store? Not just general goods, but specialized items that people in town need, but have to travel to get. Medical supplies, perhaps, or women's clothing that isn't available anywhere else in the county. That would take capital, Frank said practically, but she could see interest sparking in his eyes. Investment, planning, risk. I know. But Papa, what's the alternative? I can sit in this apartment for the rest of my life, grateful for whatever. Scraps of respect people are willing to throw my way, or I can build something of my own. Something that doesn't depend on what other people think of me. Frank was quiet for a moment, considering. You'd be competing with some established businesses. The Whitmores have investments in several stores in town, and they wouldn't appreciate the competition. Let them try to stop me, Margaret said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. What's the worst they can do? Refuse to shop at our store? Convince their friends to boycott us? I'm already persona non grata with that crowd. At least this way, I'd be persona non grata with my own business. A slow smile spread across Frank's weathered face. You know what? You're right. We've been so worried about keeping everyone happy that we've forgotten what it feels like to really go after something we want. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with possibilities. What did you have in mind specifically? For the next hour, they talked through ideas with an enthusiasm Margaret hadn't felt since before her accident. They discussed inventory, suppliers, potential locations for expansion, and the kinds of services that were missing in Millbrook. Frank proved to have ideas of his own that he'd been quietly nurturing for years, plans he'd never pursued because they seemed too risky or unconventional. "There's one other thing," Margaret said as their conversation wound down. "Those men I met today, Thomas and the others, they're good people who've been treated badly by this town. If we do this, if we build something new, I want it to be the kind of place where everyone is welcome. Veterans, people with disabilities, anyone who's been written off by polite society." Frank studied her face in the lamplight. "That's a noble sentiment, Margaret, but it could cost us business from the more conservative folks in town. Then they can shop somewhere else," Margaret replied without hesitation. "I'm tired of trying to win approval from people who will never see me as anything more than a source of gossip anyway. I'd rather have the respect of people who understand what it's like to be judged unfairly." "Your mother would have said exactly the same thing," Frank said with obvious pride. "All right then. Tomorrow morning we start planning. We'll figure out what we need, where we can get it, and how to make this work." As they made their way to their respective bedrooms, Margaret felt a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey she'd consumed earlier. For the first time since her accident, she was looking forward to the future instead of mourning the past. But as she prepared for bed, carefully hanging up the wedding dress that had become a symbol of her transformation, Margaret heard voices outside on the street below. She moved to the window and peered through the curtains, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A group of men had gathered in front of the general store, not the casual crowd that might collect for gossip or entertainment, but an organized assembly with an unmistakably threatening atmosphere. She recognized several faces in the lamplight: Buck Morrison and Pete Connolly from the Saloon, along with two of the Whitmore ranch hands, and several other men whose names she didn't know, but whose hostile expressions were clear enough. They were talking in low, urgent tones, occasionally gesturing toward the store's entrance or up at the apartment windows. Margaret couldn't make out their words, but their body language suggested they were working themselves up to some kind of action. In the center of the group stood Charles Whitmore, no longer wearing his wedding attire but dressed in the rough clothes of a working rancher. Even from her window, Margaret could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. As she watched, one of the men, she thought it might be Buck Morrison, pointed directly at her window. The group's attention turned upward, and for a heart-stopping moment, Margaret found herself looking directly into Charles's eyes across the distance. She stepped back from the window quickly, her heart racing. Whatever was happening down there, it wasn't good. The men below had the look of a mob, working itself up to violence, and she was apparently their target. Moving as quietly as possible, Margaret crept to her father's bedroom door and knocked softly. "Papa," she whispered urgently. "Papa, wake up. We have trouble." Frank appeared at the door within seconds, instantly alert in the way of a man who'd learned to respond quickly to crisis. "What is it?" "There are men outside," Margaret said quietly. "A lot of them, and they don't look friendly." Frank moved to the front window and peered through the curtains, his expression growing grim as he took in the scene below. "How many?" "Maybe a dozen. Charles is with them, and some of the men from the saloon. They're drunk," Frank observed, his voice tight with concern. "And they're angry about something. This isn't good, Margaret. This isn't good at all." As if summoned by his words, a voice called out from the street below, loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood, slurred with alcohol, but carrying clearly in the night air. "Margaret Thornfield!" Buck Morrison's voice boomed. "You come down here and face what you've done. You've made fools of decent men today, and it's time to answer for it. The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Margaret looked at her father, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. But underneath the fear, she found something else, the same steel that had carried her through the day's earlier confrontations. "I'm not hiding from them," she said quietly but firmly. "I'm not going to cower in here while they try to intimidate me." "Margaret, no," Frank said urgently. "There are too many of them, and they've been drinking. Let me handle this." But Margaret was already moving toward the door, her chin set in a line that would have been familiar to anyone who'd known her mother. She'd claimed her independence that afternoon in Macready's saloon, and she wasn't about to surrender it now to a crowd of drunken bullies. "This is my fight, Papa," she said. "It's time I finished it." Margaret descended the stairs to the stores, front entrance with measured steps, her father close behind, despite her protests. Each footfall seemed to echo in the narrow stairwell, and she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Through the glass panels of the store's front door, she could see the silhouettes of the men gathered outside, their shadows dancing in the flickering light of the street lamps. "Margaret, please reconsider this," Frank whispered urgently as they reached the main floor of the store. "These men are looking for trouble, and giving it to them won't solve anything." "Maybe not," Margaret replied, her hand on the door handle. "But hiding from them won't solve anything either, and I'm tired of letting other people decide what happens to me." She turned the key in the lock and pulled the door open, stepping out onto the wooden sidewalk that fronted the general store. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the familiar sense of dust and distant cattle, but underneath those comforting odors was something else, the sharp tang of alcohol and male aggression that made her instinctively want to retreat. The group of men shifted restlessly as she appeared, their earlier bravado tempered by the reality of confronting a woman face to face. In the lamplight, Margaret could see that several of them looked uncomfortable with the situation they'd found themselves in, but the core group, Buck Morrison, Pete Connolly and Charles, maintained their hostile postures. "Well, well," Buck said, his words slurring slightly, but his voice carrying clearly in the quiet night. "Look who finally decided to show her face, the runaway bride herself." "I'm here," Margaret said simply, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "What do you want? What do we want?" Pete Connolly stepped forward, swaying slightly on his feet. "We want to know who the hell you think you are, causing trouble all over town, making decent folks look like fools." "I haven't made anyone look like anything," Margaret replied. "If people look foolish, perhaps they should examine their own behavior." The comment drew angry mutters from several men in the crowd, but it was Charles who stepped forward to speak. Up close, Margaret could see that he'd been drinking heavily. His eyes were bloodshot, and his usually perfect appearance was disheveled. "You humiliated me today, Margaret," he said, his voice thick with alcohol and resentment. "Walking into that saloon in your wedding dress, making a spectacle of yourself, telling everyone our private business. Do you have any idea what that's done to my reputation?" Margaret stared at him in genuine amazement. "Your reputation. Charles, you left me at the altar. You abandoned me on our wedding day because your mother threatened to cut off your money, and you're worried about your reputation." "That's not how it happened," Charles protested, though his words lacked conviction. "I explained the situation to you. I thought you understood the impossible position I was in." "The only thing I understood," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "was that when it came down to choosing between me and your inheritance, the choice was easy for you." Buck Morrison spat in the dust at her feet. "Listen to her, talking like she's the wronged party here. You made your choice too, lady, when you decided to go drinking with soldiers and embarrass this whole town. Those veterans showed me more respect in one afternoon than any of you have shown in months," Margaret shot back. "They treated me like a human being instead of a piece of damaged property." "Respect?" Pete Connolly laughed harshly. "Those broken-down soldiers don't respect anything." They're drunks and misfits who can't adjust to normal life. That's the company you want to keep." Before Margaret could respond, a new voice cut through the night air from behind the crowd of men. "Did someone mention soldiers?" Every head turned to see Thomas Hartwell approaching from the direction of Main Street, his military bearing unmistakable even in the dim light. Behind him walked Danny Rodriguez, Billy Crawford, and Jim Morrison, their formation loose but clearly coordinated. Margaret noticed that Thomas had pinned his medals back onto his jacket, the ribbons and metal gleaming softly in the lamplight. "This doesn't concern you, soldier boy," Buck Morrison snarled, but Margaret could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. The odds had just shifted dramatically, and everyone present knew it. "Funny thing about that," Thomas replied conversationally, as he and his companions positioned themselves between Margaret and the hostile crowd. "When I see a dozen men ganging up on one woman, I tend to take it personally. Call it a character flaw." Charles stepped forward, trying to reassert control of the situation. "Thomas, this is between Margaret and me. It's a private matter." "Private?" Danny Rodriguez limped into the circle of lamplight, his prosthetic leg clicking slightly against the wooden sidewalk. "Seems pretty public to me, Charles. Hard to call. In private when you're conducting it in the middle of Main Street with an audience. We're just trying to talk sense into her," Pete Connolly said defensively. "Make her understand the damage she's done to her reputation and the reputation of decent folks in this town." "Ah," Billy Crawford said, his voice dripping with false understanding. "So this is about reputation. Well, gentlemen, let me tell you about reputation. I had a fine reputation when I shipped out to Korea. Bank clerk, upstanding citizen, pillar of the community. But funny thing, when I came back missing 3 fingers and jumping at every loud noise, that reputation didn't seem to count for much anymore." The crowd of men shifted uncomfortably. Several of them had served in World War II themselves, and they understood the implied criticism in Billy's words. "That's different," Charles said weakly. "You served your country. You were wounded in battle." "And Margaret was wounded in an accident," Thomas said quietly. "Does the cause of the injury really determine whether someone deserves basic human decency?" Jim Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying that slight uncertainty of someone who couldn't gauge his own volume, but his words were clear and sharp. "Seems to me the real question here is, what kind of men gang up on a woman who's already been through hell? Because where I come from, we call that cowardice." The accusation hit the group like a physical blow. Several men took involuntary steps backward, and Margaret could see the doubt beginning to spread through their ranks. These were men who prided themselves on their toughness, their ability to handle whatever challenges life threw at them. Being called cowards by decorated veterans was an insult that cut deep. "Now hold on just a minute," Buck Morrison blustered, but his earlier confidence was clearly shaken. "Nobody called us cowards. We're just trying to maintain some standards in this town, some sense of what's proper and what isn't." "Standards," Thomas repeated, his voice thoughtful, "like the standard that says a man should keep his word when he promises to marry someone, or the standard that says you don't abandon people when they need you most." Charles's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand the complexities of the situation, the responsibilities involved." "I understand responsibility just fine," Thomas replied, his hand moving unconsciously to touch the medals on his chest. "I understand what it means to make a commitment and stick to it, even when things get difficult, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted." Margaret watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. Once again, these men she'd only met that afternoon were standing up for her, risking their own safety to defend her choices and her dignity. "This is ridiculous," Pete Connolly said, but his voice lacked its earlier venom. "We didn't come here to fight with soldiers. We came to talk sense into Margaret, "And you've had your say," Frank Thornfield spoke up from behind Margaret, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent decades dealing with difficult customers. "Now, I think it's time for all of you to move along before this gets out of hand." "Frank," Charles said, turning to appeal to Margaret's father, "surely you can see that this situation is getting out of control. Margaret's making decisions that will affect her for the rest of her life. She needs guidance, not encouragement in this reckless behavior." Frank looked at Charles for a long moment, and Margaret could see old anger kindling in her father's eyes. "Charles, you forfeited any right to concern yourself with my daughter's welfare when you walked out on her this morning. What she chooses to do with her life now is her business, not yours." "But the scandal," Charles began. "The scandal," Frank interrupted, "started when you left her at the altar, not when she decided to have a drink afterward. If you're worried about scandal, perhaps you should examine your own actions instead of trying to control hers." The rebuke from Margaret's father seemed to deflate Charles's remaining defiance. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, some supportive, others doubtful, all of them watching to see how he would respond to this public dressing down. "Fine," he said finally, his voice hollow with defeat. "Fine. If that's how everyone wants to play this, then so be it. But don't come crying to me when you realize what you've thrown away, Margaret. Don't expect me to pick up the pieces when this fantasy of independence collapses around you. I wouldn't dream of it," Margaret replied coolly. "I think we've established quite clearly that you're not someone I can depend on when things get difficult." Charles stared at her for a moment longer, perhaps hoping to see some sign of regret or uncertainty in her expression. But Margaret met his gaze steadily, and whatever he saw there seemed to convince him that this particular battle was lost. "Come on," he said to the men around him. "Let's get out of here. There's nothing more to be accomplished tonight." Several of the men seemed relieved to have an excuse to leave, but Buck Morrison and Pete Connolly looked reluctant to abandon their confrontation. "This isn't over," Buck said, directing his words at Thomas rather than Margaret. "This town has standards, and we won't let a bunch of broken-down soldiers tear them apart." "Standards are fine," Thomas replied evenly. "Just make sure they apply equally to everyone, because from where I'm standing, it looks like the people doing the most damage to this town's reputation are the ones pointing fingers at others." The implied threat in his words was unmistakable, and Buck seemed to realize that pushing the confrontation further would likely end badly for him and his companions. With obvious reluctance, he turned and began walking away, Pete Connolly and the other men following in his wake. Charles lingered for a moment longer, his eyes moving between Margaret and the four veterans who had positioned themselves protectively around her. "You think you've won something here," he said quietly, his words directed specifically at Margaret. "But you've just traded everything stable and secure in your life for the friendship of a bunch of misfits. When the novelty wears off, when reality sets in, you'll understand what you've lost." "Maybe," Margaret replied, "but I'll also understand what I've gained. And right now, that seems like a fair trade." Charles shook his head in apparent disbelief and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk as he disappeared into the darkness beyond the street lamps. As the last of the hostile crowd dispersed, Margaret felt her knees begin to shake with reaction. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was wearing off, leaving her feeling drained and slightly nauseous. "You all right?" Thomas asked, noticing her unsteadiness. "I think so," Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely sure. "Just processing everything that happened." "You did good," Danny said approvingly. "Stood your ground, didn't back down when they tried to intimidate you. That takes real courage." "I don't feel courageous," Margaret admitted. "I feel terrified and exhilarated and completely overwhelmed all at the same time." "That's what courage is," Billy said with a grin. "Being scared out of your mind but doing what needs to be done anyway." Frank stepped forward, his expression mixing pride with concern. "Margaret, I think perhaps we should go back inside. It's been a long day and you need rest." "In a minute, Papa," Margaret said. She turned to face the 4 veterans who had once again come to her defense. "I don't know how to thank you. Twice in one day, you've stood up for me when you had no obligation to do so." "No obligation, maybe," Thomas said, "but plenty of motivation. What we did tonight, we did because it was right, and because you're worth defending. Besides," Jim added with his characteristic too loud voice, "we told you earlier, we're not going anywhere. That wasn't just talk." Margaret felt tears threatening again, but these were tears of gratitude and overwhelming emotion rather than sadness or despair. In the space of one extraordinary day, she'd lost a fiancé, gained a new understanding of herself, and found a group of friends who seemed to value her for exactly who she was. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing the question that had become a recurring theme throughout the day. "Now," Thomas said, glancing around at his companions, "we make sure nobody bothers you again tonight. Tomorrow, we start figuring out how to build the life you want instead of the one other people think you should have." "You don't have to," Margaret began, but Danny cut her off. "Yes, we do," he said firmly. "That's what friends do for each other. They show up when it matters." As they said their goodnights and the veterans headed back toward their own lodgings, Margaret stood on the sidewalk with her father, watching their retreating figures disappear into the darkness. "Quite a day," Frank observed quietly. "Quite a day," Margaret agreed. "Papa, are you sure you're not ashamed of me? Of what I've done? The choices I've made?" Frank put his arm around her shoulders, something he hadn't done since she was a child. "Margaret, 24 hours ago, you were planning to marry a man who saw you as a burden. Tonight, you're standing here having just faced down a hostile crowd with the support of people who see you as someone worth defending. If that's not progress, I don't know what is." As they climbed the stairs back to their apartment, Margaret realized that her father was right. Despite the chaos and uncertainty, despite the bridges she'd burned and the future she'd abandoned, she felt more herself than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make about the direction of her life. But tonight, for the first time since her accident, Margaret Thornfield fell asleep without wondering whether she was good enough, strong enough, or worthy enough to deserve happiness. She simply was. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of what had once been Henderson's old warehouse, watching as Thomas and Danny carefully maneuvered a heavy wooden display case through the entrance. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and golden leaves drifted past the windows of what would soon become Millbrook's newest business venture. "Easy on that corner," she called out, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had grown comfortable giving directions. "We need it positioned so customers can see the medical supplies from both the main entrance and the clothing section." The UN transformation of the warehouse had taken most of the summer and fall, but it was finally nearing completion. What had started as a desperate conversation between Margaret and her father in their kitchen had evolved into something far more ambitious. A general store and medical supply depot that would serve not just Millbrook, but the surrounding counties as well. "Where do you want the furniture section?" Billy Crawford asked, emerging from the back room where he'd been assembling displays for the household goods they'd be carrying. His missing fingers no longer seemed to bother him when he worked, and Margaret had discovered he had a natural talent for woodworking that made him invaluable for the store's setup. "Along the west wall," Margaret replied, consulting the detailed floor plan she'd drawn up weeks earlier. "That way it catches the afternoon light, and customers can see the quality of the craftsmanship." The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of activity, planning, and occasional setbacks. True to her prediction, Victoria Whitmore had attempted to sabotage their efforts by pressuring suppliers and spreading rumors about the questionable nature of their business partnership with the veterans. But Margaret had discovered that her new reputation as someone who didn't back down from a fight had opened as many doors as it had closed. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Patterson approached them about carrying medical supplies that weren't available anywhere else in the region. His endorsement had legitimized their venture in the eyes of many townspeople who might otherwise have been swayed by the Whitmore family's influence. "Margaret," Frank called from the office area they'd set up in the back corner, "the last shipment from Dallas arrived this morning. Everything we ordered, plus a few extra items the supplier thought we might want to try." Margaret made her way through the organized chaos of the store's interior, stepping carefully around boxes of inventory and partially assembled displays. The space was larger than their original general store, with high ceilings and large windows that flooded the interior with natural light. It felt like possibility made manifest, a physical representation of the new life she'd chosen to build. In the office, Frank was going through shipping manifests with the methodical precision that had made their original store successful. But there was an energy in his movements now that hadn't been there before, an enthusiasm that spoke of a man who'd rediscovered his passion for commerce and growth. "Any problems with the delivery?" Margaret asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "None at all. In fact, our contact in Dallas mentioned that word is spreading about what we're doing here. Apparently, we're getting a reputation as a progressive business that serves customers other establishments won't touch." Margaret smiled at that. It was exactly the reputation she'd hoped to build, though she knew it came with risks as well as rewards. The bell above the front door chimed, and Margaret looked up to see Sheriff Hayes entering the store. Over the past months, he'd become something of an unofficial advocate for their venture, helping them navigate the legal and practical challenges of establishing a new business while managing the social tensions their success had created. "Afternoon. Folks," Hayes said, removing his hat as he approached the office area. "Thought you'd want to know. Had an interesting conversation with Charles Whitmore earlier today." Margaret felt her stomach tighten slightly. Charles had largely avoided her since the confrontation outside the general store, but she'd heard through the town's gossip network that his life hadn't proceeded smoothly since their broken engagement. His mother's threats about inheritance had proven to be largely bluster. She needed Charles to run the ranch more than she needed to punish him for his romantic choices. "What did he want?" Frank asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Seems he's been watching your progress here with considerable interest," Hayes replied. "Asked a lot of questions about your suppliers, your customer base, your plans for expansion." "Spying for his mother?" Margaret asked. "That's what I thought at first," Hayes admitted. "But then he asked me something that made me reconsider. He wanted to know if you'd be willing to talk to him, not about reconciliation," he added quickly, seeing Margaret's expression, "but about business." Margaret exchanged glances with her father. "Business? Apparently young Charles has been having some disagreements with his mother about the ranch's operations. She's been resistant to modernization, to adopting new methods that might improve their efficiency and profitability. Charles thinks you might have some insights that could help him." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. The same man who'd abandoned her because she couldn't help him build a traditional family legacy was now interested in her business acumen. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That it wasn't my place to speak for you," Hayes replied. "But if he wanted to have a conversation, he should approach you directly instead of going through intermediaries." Before Margaret could respond, the front door chimed again, and Thomas entered carrying a bouquet of wildflowers and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Margaret," he called out, "you need to see this." He approached the office area, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something approaching jubilation. In his free hand, he carried an official-looking envelope that he placed on Frank's desk with ceremony. "What is it?" Margaret asked, curious about his obvious excitement. Letter from the Veterans Administration in Austin, Thomas said, his grin wide enough to split his face. They've been hearing about what we're doing here, about how we've created a business that provides employment and dignity for disabled veterans. They want to feature our story in their newsletter, maybe use us as a model for other communities. Margaret felt her breath catch. Recognition from the VA would bring legitimacy to their venture that even Victoria Whitmore couldn't undermine. There's more, Thomas continued. They're considering a pilot program that would provide low-interest loans to businesses that employ veterans with service-connected disabilities. If we qualify, we could expand faster than we ever imagined. Frank whistled, low under his breath. That could change everything. It already has changed everything, Margaret said, looking around at the store they'd built from nothing but determination and mutual support. But yes, this could make it bigger than we dreamed. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity as they processed the implications of the VA's interest and continued preparing for their official opening the following week. Margaret found herself moving through the store with a sense of ownership and pride that felt completely different from anything she'd experienced before. As evening approached and the others began heading home for dinner, Margaret remained behind to finish organizing the medical supply section. She was arranging bandages and antiseptics when she heard the front door chime one more time. Looking up, she saw Charles Whitmore standing hesitantly in the entrance, his hat in his hands and his expression uncertain. He looked older than she, remembered, more weathered, as if the past months had aged him in ways that went beyond simple time. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. "Charles?" Her voice was carefully neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. "I hope you don't mind me coming by. Sheriff Hayes said he'd spoken to you about a conversation I'd like to have." Margaret set down the box of supplies she'd been holding and studied his face, the arrogance and entitlement that had characterized him during their engagement seemed to have been replaced by something more humble, more uncertain. "What kind of conversation?" she asked. Charles looked around the store, taking in the organized displays, the professional signage, the obvious care that had gone into every detail. "I wanted to talk about what you've built here, about how you've managed to create something so successful in such a short time." "Why?" "Because," Charles said, his voice dropping with what sounded like genuine humility, "I've been watching what you've accomplished, and I've realized that I was wrong about a lot of things. About you, about what makes a person valuable, about what really matters in life." Margaret waited for him to continue, curious despite herself about where this conversation was heading. "The ranch is failing," Charles admitted. "Mother's old-fashioned methods aren't working anymore, and she won't listen to suggestions for improvement. We're losing money, losing workers, losing our place in the community. Meanwhile, you've built something that's thriving, that's making a real difference in people's lives." "And you want what exactly? Business advice?" "I want to understand how you did it," Charles said earnestly. "How you took what seemed like the worst possible situation and turned it into something better than anything you'd had before." Margaret considered his words carefully. There was something different about Charles now, a sincerity that had been missing during their relationship. But she also remembered the pain of his abandonment, the casual way he dismissed her worth when it became inconvenient. "The first thing I learned," she said finally, "was that other people's opinions about my worth were just that, opinions. They had no power over me unless I gave it to them." Charles nodded, absorbing this. "And after that?" "After that, I stopped trying to fit into a life that wasn't designed for me and started building one that was. I surrounded myself with people who saw my potential instead of my limitations, who valued what I could contribute instead of mourning what I couldn't provide." She gestured around the store, encompassing not just the physical space, but everything it represented. "This isn't just a business, Charles. It's proof that people who've been written off by society can build something meaningful together. It's A place where veterans can find work that respects their skills, where people with disabilities can access supplies they need, where anyone who's been judged unfairly can find acceptance. Charles hesitated, then pressed forward. Could someone who's made terrible mistakes find acceptance here too? The question hung between them, weighted with months of history and hurt. Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of the man who'd left her at the altar out of fear and weakness. That would depend, she said carefully, on whether that person had truly learned from their mistakes or was just looking for an easy way out of the consequences. I've learned, Charles said quietly. I've learned that courage isn't about avoiding difficult choices. It's about making the right choice, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. I've learned that a person's worth isn't determined by what they can provide for others, but by who they choose to be when things get hard. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The Charles standing before her now seemed genuinely different from the man who'd broken their engagement, humbled by experience and honest about his failures. What are you asking me, Charles? I'm asking if there might be room in your new life for someone who wants to learn how to be better. Not as a romantic partner, he added quickly, but as someone who respects what you've built and wants to contribute to it. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, weighing the request against everything that had happened between them. Finally, she spoke. The people who work here, who are part of what we've built, they're here because they've proven they can be trusted. They've shown that they'll stand up for each other when it matters, that they'll put the welfare of the group ahead of their own comfort. And you don't think I can do that? I think, Margaret said carefully, that you'll have to prove it. Not to me, but to everyone. Thomas, Danny, Billy, Jim, they're the ones who stood by me when I needed support. If you want to be part of this, you'll need to earn their trust as well as mine. Charles nodded slowly. How do I do that? You start by showing up, Margaret replied. You do the work, you treat everyone with respect, and you prove through your actions that you've changed. Words are easy, Charles. Consistent behavior over time is what matters. And if I do that, if I prove I've changed? Margaret smiled, feeling lighter than she had since he'd walked through the door. Then maybe we can build something together. After all, not the life we planned before, but something better, something real. As Charles left that evening, promising to return the next day ready to work, Margaret stood alone in the store she'd created from nothing but determination and hope. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and in the distance she could hear the sound of Thomas and the others laughing as they made their way home from Jake's. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman defined by her limitations, dependent on others for validation and security. Tonight, she was a successful business owner, surrounded by people who valued her for her strength and intelligence, building something that made a real difference in her community. The wedding dress hanging in her closet at home had been cleaned and carefully stored, not as a reminder of what she'd lost, but as a symbol of what she'd gained. The courage to walk into McCready's saloon in that dress had been the first step toward becoming the person she was meant to be. And as Margaret locked up the store and headed home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, she realized that the laughter that had greeted her entrance into the saloon months ago had been replaced by something far more valuable: the respect of people who mattered, and most importantly, respect for herself. The woman who'd limped into that saloon in a wedding dress had been broken and desperate. The woman who walked home that night was whole, successful, and surrounded by love. Not the conditional love that depended on her ability to meet others' expectations, but the unconditional love of people who valued her exactly as she was. It was, Margaret reflected, a much better ending than the one she'd originally planned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.